Hi everyone. Hope you're having a good morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you're watching this. This lecture is going to be your lecture on flour and flour mixtures as well as quick breads. So the next couple lectures, your lectures the next 3 weeks, are all going to be from the larger baking PowerPoint that you'll find in the content folder or Blackboard, not in any folder for specific weeks. But I have broken them up into 3 smaller PowerPoints for you guys. So you don't have to go through the entire slide, and we're going to kind of jump around a little bit as well. So I made them into 3 separate slideshows. I'd rather you guys go off the 3 smaller PowerPoints as opposed to the larger PowerPoints, just 'cause I think that'll be a little bit easier to kind of sort through, and so you don't have to go through the audio all 140 slides at once. So yeah, this one's going to be on flour and flour mixtures and quick breads. We're kind of going to go over different kinds of flour, uses for different flours, quick breads, basic properties of quick breads, and different ingredients that are commonly used in quick breads. So that's kind of going to be our basic topics we're going to cover for this lecture. This material does also kind of jump around a little bit in your textbook as well. So it doesn't follow along exactly, but it'll follow the material in your textbook pretty closely. So this is just a little activity, I guess, to get you guys started. So there's 5 different kind of movie quotes here, and you're kind of gonna try and match the movie with the quote. And the point of this is just to kind of illustrate that bread and flour is pretty foundational in society. So it kind of illustrates the importance of that, and you guys can see the answers down below as well. I didn't know any of these, so don't feel bad if you didn't know any of them. So the basic ingredients of any quick bread or baked product are you're going to have your wet ingredients, your dry ingredients, your water, your milk, so your liquid, flour, generally eggs, not always though, sugar, butter, some kind of leavening ingredients like baking soda and baking powder. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between those two later. Yeast for yeast breads, and salt. So these are kind of the basic ingredients that'll be in most quick breads, with the exception of yeast, which aren't in quick breads. So tenderness and toughness in flour mixtures. So there's different factors that can tenderize or toughen flour mixtures, which you might need for various things. So tenderizers will be things like acids, like a vinegar, egg yolk, fat, or sugar. Tougheners will be like egg white or whole egg because of all that protein content in there. Flour is kind of a toughener. Milk and water. So flour is basically a powdered endosperm of seeds of other starchy foods. Wheat's the most common. That's what you find in like an all-purpose flour, but can also be found from oats, rye, barley, rice, corn. You can make flour from any kind of thing that has an endosperm, so any kind of cereal or grain really. Okay, so those are non-cereal sources like soy, potato, cattail, taro, and arrowroot. I think these kind of non-traditional flours are being a bit more common in recent years. One thing I actually tried recently was like a cricket insect flour. Well, not recently; it was about 4 or 5 years ago. But you'll see all sorts of different kind of flours, like high protein options, gluten-free options, just because of kind of various health reasons people have for wanting to choose a different flour. A lot of people try and shy away from refined flours now, so maybe whole wheat flours are a little more popular, but also a lot of these kind of alternative flours as well. Flour is important for a variety of factors. So the structure is to be strong enough to rise and hold leavening. It strengthens through gelatinization. We talked about starch gelatinization a little while ago, and also contributes to kind of the crumb or how the interior of a baked product crumbles, which is generally what's meant by crumb. It's kind of the texture of the interior. Flavor, so there's different flavors associated with different types of flours. If you guys have had like whole wheat flours compared with all-purpose flours, you'll notice the taste is a little bit different there as well. And the reactive components. So starches, so they will gelatinize, and also gluten formation, which is important for providing structure to the final product, and you want variable amounts of gluten in different products. So for like a biscuit, you'd want a relatively low concentration of gluten, whereas for a bread, a much more structured product, you're going to want a higher concentration of gluten. So this is a little graph showing you the basic kinds of proteins in wheat flour. So you see the two proteins that form gluten in there, gliadin and glutenin, and that forms about 85% of the protein in flour. Whereas there's also other proteins in flour, it's a less significant percentage, like 15% or so. And the gluten is kind of the one that forms the dough, which is what you need for like a bread or anything like that. Yep. So gluten formation. So gluten, like we kind of talked about before, it's the protein portion of wheat flour with kind of the elastic properties you need for structure. Or so gluten is able to kind of expand with the gas within the baked products. So that's going to help give it that structure, and its elasticity is really important there. In addition, the more protein that's in the flours, the more of the gluten, gliadin, and the more water is absorbed. So for a high protein baked product, you're going to need a bit more water than a low protein baked product. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. Kneading the dough is really important for developing that gluten formation. So kneading the dough helps kind of develop that gluten structure, which is why you need like a bread a lot more than you need to need something a bit softer, or like a biscuit where you only need it maybe like 10 times or so. If any of you have ever had seitan, it's kind of another meat alternative product. I don't know how common it is anymore. I feel like I saw it a bit more a few years ago, but it's basically made from wheat gluten. And one thing you notice if you eat seitan is that it has a very kind of chewy texture to it compared to a lot of other meat alternatives which maybe don't have that chewiness. And that kind of illustrates that gluten has that elasticity to it. And so it's kind of a more isolated form of that. So if you ever have seitan, that kind of illustrates the elasticity of gluten. So gluten formation, you can find that also in oats, rye, and barley in addition to wheat flour. Its goal with gluten formation is to form a very high amount in yeast spreads and lesser amounts in like biscuits, relatively controlled amounts in muffins, and a lower amount in cakes, as well as like popovers and things like that. Due to their high liquid content, that's kind of interferes with gluten formation. Variable gluten formation is really important with baked products. Most bread, more gluten is desirable, less so with biscuits. You think of biscuits are a bit more soft and crumbly, as well as like with cakes and popovers. You don't really want those to be very structured and more hard. You want them to be a bit softer. So the ability to have gluten in varying quantities is an important aspect of flour. So gluten, so you can actually also separate the gluten from the flour by kneading the dough under cold running water, so you can kind of get a mass of gluten as well. So that would be kind of a way if you want to separate the gluten from the flour. This doesn't by any means make it safe for somebody with celiac disease or something like that. So there's still going to be some gluten residue in there, but you can get a lot of the gluten separated from that. These are different gluten balls from different kinds of flour. So you see the gluten balls from cake flour, all-purpose flour, and bread flour. Most notably, you'll see a much larger gluten ball. It's a little white ball there from the bread flour compared to the cake flour, because with bread flour you want it to be more structured, higher protein. So you're going to have a lot more gluten there. With the cake flour, you see it's a lot smaller, with the all-purpose flour being kind of somewhere in the middle. So kneading to develop gluten. So this is kind of the general method for kneading in the best way to ensure you're both compressing and stretching it for gluten strength, as opposed to doing just one or the other. So you're going to want to make a big dough ball and put it on a floured board to prevent it from sticking. Push it kind of away from the body with the heel of your hands. You can put a lot more force into it if you use the heel of your hands as opposed to like your fingers. And then kind of folding it over. So that's kind of that compression component, turning it and then pushing it again. So that's kind of going to ensure you're kneading it relatively evenly as well. Kneading does a lot of things in regards to bread, even outside of gluten formation. So it compresses and stretches it, which kind of evenly distributes the yeast if it's a yeast bread. It warms the dough as well, which makes it a bit more pliable. Increases the fermentation and carbon dioxide content. Yields a smooth and stretchable dough as opposed to something that's a bit more hard and kind of sticky. So it transforms it from that sticky mass to kind of that more stretchable consistency. Excess kneading, however, is a negative thing. So too much kneading can kind of break those gluten strands you've developed, and that can result in a sticky dough. It's not as elastic. So kneading again, so it's used pretty extensively in bread making and briefly with pastries and biscuits. We'll talk about like the 10 point kneading a little bit later, which is what you use for biscuits to ensure you're not over kneading it. So wheat flour, obviously there's a wide variety of wheat flours. So you find white flour, all-purpose pastry, all-purpose flour, all-purpose pastry flour, cake flour, gluten in flour, durum, which makes semolina flour, which is used for pasta, and whole wheat flour. And on the table on the right here, you'll see kind of the varying protein contents of those different flours. So you like the durum wheat that you use for pasta is very high protein, along with like the whole wheat and bread flour, compared to like a cake and pastry, which are a bit lower in protein. So it's going to impact the hardness of those. So measuring flour, there's a link here to King Arthur Flours, and it's showing you how to measure flour. Basically to show you kind of a fluff, sprinkle, and scrape technique. So it's fluffing up the flour before you put it into your measuring cup, and kind of sprinkling it into the measuring cup so you have a consistent volume of your flour, and then scraping it off, so leveling it off at the end. However, it's generally more accurate to weigh flour for a recipe as compared to measuring it. So you guys probably know there's a lot of ways you can compact flour or sifting it or anything like that to increase or decrease the volume of it. So weight is generally a bit more accurate than volume. So if you have a weight measurement or a scale, that's usually going to be a bit of a better bet for you. As long as that scale is accurate and calibrated it correctly, that's probably going to be your best bet. So vital wheat gluten, so this is kind of the isolated protein of wheat. It's used as a meat substitute, seitan, and it's used to increase protein content and produce simulated meat products. It's also used as an added ingredient in some variety of products as well. It increases leavening, kind of adds chewy, meaty texture to other dishes as well. It's also one of the highest protein kind of meat replacement options out there, even higher than most of the soybean products like tofu and tempeh. It does have a low lysine content, which is one of the essential amino acids. So you'd want to pair it with legumes for a complementary protein, or eat legumes at some point in the near future or prior to eating seitan, just so you can make sure you're getting that lysine content in there as well, because that is one of the essential amino acids that your body doesn't synthesize in the quantities it needs for muscle synthesis. It's added to various things as well. It increases volume in bread, especially if they contain like dry fruits or nuts. So flour storage. So flour should be stored in pest-proof containers and kept in a cool, relatively dry place. White flour will keep for about a year, whereas whole grain flour should actually be refrigerated and can only be held there for like 3 months. So this is kind of another reason that whole grain products are a bit more expensive compared to white flour. So they have to be refrigerated after opening, which is like in a commercial sort of cooking setting, that can be pretty inconvenient if you have limited refrigerator space. That's another reason why white flour is often used as opposed to whole grain flours. And look at the time they keep them. So the whole grain flour keeps for only 3 months compared to a year for the white flour. That's kind of another consideration that's important to keep in mind, especially if you're not using flour very often. That could be another reason why someone would choose white flour over the whole grain flour, even if the whole grain uh, flours have a bit more of that fiber content and the B and E vitamins that we talked about in the cereals lecture. So leavening agents, there's a variety of different agents that can cause bread to rise. Baking powder and baking soda, so those chemical agents are the most common in the quick breads. But you can also use air and steam, which would be like in a popover or something like that. So those will be like physical agents and biological agents as well. So like yeast breads will use yeast, and there's other bacteria that can also act as a biological agent to create that leavening effect in baked products. These leavening ingredients, they contribute volume as well as texture to the product. So the number of air cells and the size of air cells will kind of contribute that airiness to baked products, especially things like popovers. It's really important, as well as the volume. And so you want baked products to have a certain amount of volume to them as well, so they have to rise when you're baking them. So air isn't as common as the primary leavener. It's primary if you're using egg whites or whipped cream as the leavener because there's a lot of air incorporated into them. Remember the times when you've made meringues in labs, so that's incorporating air into egg whites to make those foams. Secondary in most baked goods, so most baked goods will incorporate air to some degree, but it's not going to be their um, primary form of leavening. You can also kind of incorporate air by sifting your dry ingredients like flour. That's also going to incorporate some air into the product, so that's kind of another way to do that. Creaming fat and sugar as well also incorporates some air into baked products. Steam, so that's the primary leavening ingredients if you have a really high liquid to flour ratio, so if you're using more of a pour batter compared to a drop batter, because the pour batters have a bit of a higher liquid to flour ratio compared to the drop batters. So for those ones, you're going to use steam to a fair amount. So an example would be like popovers, cream puffs, and puff pastries. I believe crepes as well primarily use steam as their leavening agent. And as well as a lot of the breads you wouldn't think of as being particularly leavened, steam is actually the primary leavener there, but it is a secondary leavener in most ingredients. Baking soda. So baking soda, usually it's not used alone. Baking soda is basic, as you guys probably know. Oh, so you only use it when you're including acid ingredients, and that's going to yield carbonic acid. And I don't know if you guys have taken organic chemistry, but you can use the equation up above for baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, as long as acidic ingredients, that's going to create carbonic acid. You guys have probably also heard of the carbonic acid buffer system in the human body. So creating that carbonic acid is a way for acids and bases to kind of combine, keeping the pH relatively neutral. Well, which is why you would add baking soda in with an acidic ingredient because you don't want to adversely affect the pH of the product, which would affect flavor as well as appearance. So you'd only use baking soda if you're doing like buttermilk or lemon juice or anything like that. Otherwise, you can only use baking powder, which is more neutral. Yeah, so baking powders consist of a mixture of baking soda, some kind of acid, and an inert filler like cornstarch. So baking powders kind of already have that acid added to them as well, and they also have kind of a filler in there as well. There's two types of baking powder, and that's a fast or single-acting powder, which I believe is mostly more for commercial baking. You're not really going to see as much single-acting powder in like a common home setting, or a double-acting baking powder, which is kind of something you're probably a bit more used to. Most baking powder you've probably worked with is double-acting, unless you've worked in a bakery or something like that. And the primary reason for this is because the single-acting baking powder, that one's going to be more after you put it in and you combine it with your ingredients, you have to bake them right away. Whereas with double-acting, you don't necessarily have to do that. Yeah, so baking powder, so the single-acting powder, CO2 production begins as soon as water is added, so you have to put it in the oven as soon as possible. Whereas double-acting baking powder actually gonna react twice. Once when it's moistened, then again during heating. So that kind of gives you a bit more of a window as far as adding the baking powder and then putting it in the oven. And then quick breads. So quick breads are kind of baked together immediately after the ingredients are mixed. So there's no waiting for that yeast fermentation that you'd see in like a yeast bread. So they're basically breads you can consume and create relatively quickly, which is why they're called quick breads. Leavening. So leavening in quick breads occurs from air, steam, or carbon dioxide action. Carbon dioxide is what's basically produced from the carbonic acid that baking soda or baking powder produce. So that carbon dioxide acts as a leavener along with the air and steam. Basic ingredients for quick breads. So flour is going to develop that gluten structure. Water is an important solvent and also hydrates the proteins and is necessary for starch gelatinization. Other liquids, mainly milks, sometimes nut milks are used as well. And that's going to add some flavor and tenderness as well as helping with browning of some baked products. Possibly salt, so that's going to add and enhance some other flavors in there as well. And then it definitely needs leavening agents, either baking soda or baking powder. So preparing quick breads, So quick breads also usually have some kind of fat, so you generally butter or some other fat or fat replacer like applesauce. That's going to affect gluten structure as well as the crumbs, so that interior texture and the mouthfeel of the product when you eat it. Eggs as well, and they help coagulate and retain structure, so eggs are important. Especially if you use like gluten-free flour recipes, a lot of times they'll have eggs in there or egg yolks, and that's to kind of help give them that structure that they lack because they lack gluten. Sugar as well. Sugar adds flavor and it also affects gluten structure and adds in some tenderness as well. So there's two important considerations when preparing quick bread, and that's the consistency of the batter and your cooking temperature. Consistency of the batter is going to rely on the liquid to flour ratio, so you'll have pour batters where there's a relatively equal amount of liquid and flours, and drop batters are a bit more solid, so you have a bit more flour compared to liquids. And you'll just want different amounts for different sorts of baked products. The cooking temperature is also relatively important. So the muffin method is kind of the general method for a lot of baked products for combining dry and wet ingredients. So you're going to want to sift the dry ingredients together, combining the moist ingredients together in a separate bowl, so keeping them separate at the start, and then stir the moist and dry ingredients together quickly with just a few strokes until it's just a little bit lumpy still, but the dry ingredients are generally kind of moistened. So kneading in the muffin method, so if you're kneading it, you only need about 10 strokes, so you only do that kind of push and pull method we talked about a little earlier in the PowerPoint. You only need to do that about 10 times, and that's going to prevent the overdevelopment of gluten, which you don't really want in like a muffin or something like that, because if you have too much gluten, it's going to be very hard. This mixture is placed in a greased pan, filled about 2/3 full because it's going to expand a bit as you bake it, because you have the leavening agents in there. And these can be baked anywhere between 350 and 450 degrees, so kind of standard oven temperatures. It's done if the toothpick is clean when inserted vertically and removed, so the toothpick test is kind of the general test you use for a lot of those quick breads. So pour batters, some different products that use pour batters. So pancakes, cooked on a griddle, those use a pour batter. Crepes as well. Crepes are much thinner than pancakes due to them not having the baking soda or baking powder, so that's why they're so thin. They're also generally made on a kind of a special frying pan, which is basically like a 6-inch frying pan or so. Waffles have a bit more fat than pancakes because they use that egg in there, along with waffle iron is used to make those. Popovers as well. So steam is actually the primary leavening agent in popovers, and that's something they're able to do because they have such a high liquid ratio. And they also kind of have that hollow center in there as well from the steam evaporating. So drop batters, some quick bread products that use drop batters are muffins, muffin breads like corn breads or hush puppies, coffee cakes, and dumplings. So these are just different ones that use drop or a bit more of a solid batter to them. So common quick bread problems. So optimal stirring versus over stirring. You see there's kind of tunnels in there from the over stirring. That's kind of due to the carbon dioxide escaping from the muffin product. That's going to leave kind of holes in the middle of it and kind of adversely affect the crumb as well. Undermixing as well is also something you don't really want because that's going to lead to a relatively crumbly muffin because of the lack of structure. Yep, and you'll see on this slide, it says the top appears flat and shiny and the peak's a bit off-center, or because that carbon dioxide is trying to push through the crust, which causes it to kind of fall over. There's tunnels inside, so if it's overmixed, the carbon dioxide is going to escape along gluten strands, so that's why it's going to look like there's little tunnels inside the muffin. Stirred right, it should still have some kind of lumps and little holes in it, but it won't have large tunnels or anything like that. Doughs, so doughs are also a big product. Most products you make from dough are actually leavened by steam, so a lot of those unleavened breads technically have steam as their primary leaveners. They're just not leavened to a really significant degree. So if you think about like tortillas or crisp flatbreads, they're not really leavened in the same way that a lot of quick breads are. Doughs are a very high flour product, so they have a much higher flour ratio than even like the drop batters. You can also make some quick breads from them as well, and that includes like biscuits and scones. So they're examples of quick breads you'd make from a dough. So biscuits, these are relatively quick to prepare. They rely on fat for shortening power, so kind of having that shortening in them, and on having just the right amount of kneading to increase gluten formation. Buttermilk, so buttermilk biscuits are pretty common. That actually promotes kind of a white interior to the product, whereas they'll have kind of that yellow golden crust on the outside. Herbs and other ingredients can also kind of be added or substituted to produce different kind of variations of the basic biscuit. Buttermilk biscuits are probably the most common one you're going to see. And then remember, if you're kneading quick breads, as for dough, it's going to be a very quick kneading, about 10 strokes, so you're not going to need as much to wet a bread or something like that. And over kneading is going to make too much gluten, which is going to make the product like dense and heavy, which is why you'll need a very moderate amount of kneading for these kinds of doughs. And yeah, this is actually everything you're going to have on quick breads and flour and flour mixture. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you guys have a nice week.